I am Dustin Baker, and this is VikesNow. Going through my final solo episode about the Saints. Tomorrow we'll talk with Josh Fry, covering both the Saints' triumph and the preview of the Bears. And then, as of Thursday, we'll formally move on to Bears Week. The Bears are 2-2, the Vikings are 3-1, and they show down on Sunday at noon in Minneapolis. But to put a bow on the Saints, I'm going to go through the 8 things that I consider mini surprises, quasi surprises about the Vikings' victory in London. They're undefeated in London, 3-0 in the regular season, anyhow. So the first one is this odd Kirk Cousins dynamic. Why is it surprising? Because it's continuing. Usually through this point in the season is when you pull out a box score, you look at his generalized stat line, and you're like, this guy has 8 touchdowns to 2 interceptions, and the team is 1-3 or 2-2. Well, it's different this year. You pull out that stat line, and he's got 6 touchdowns, 4 picks, but his team is 3-1. So we're doing the inverse. One of the most frequent criticisms of Cousins, other than his contract, which is just too irresistible for folks to criticize, is the stat machine. And all he does is get stats when his team is just 500 or below 500. Well, that's not happening. It's the opposite now. He's not gangbusters with the numbers, but his team is 3-1 and positioning itself for the postseason. So I want to know, it's surprising. I want to know how long it continues this way, because right now and through the end of November is usually when he personally heats up after getting acclimated to his new offensive coordinator, because he gets one every year. This year is no different. And I want to see if these two items come together. The good Kirk, who puts up 3 touchdowns, no picks, and then the team who's finding ways to win. These curses are falling by the wayside. Greg Joseph is hitting kicks. The other kicker is missing 61-yarders. I want to know through October and November if we meet both. If we put both together, the Vikings are finding ways to get team wins while Cousins is dialing up his vintage Kirktober and Kirkvember performances. That's number 1. Number 2 is the quiet nature of Danielle Hunter. I said this on the Believe show with Sal Spice, Bryant McKinney, and Ron Saul last night, that I think what we did in the summer is we said, all right, so the Vikings are switching to a 3-4. Just look at the guy in Danielle Hunter. This guy is going to thrive. He's tall. He's muscular. He looks like an outside linebacker. Well, it's taking some getting used to. I think teams are paying more attention to him, and therefore some of the other guys are opening up, getting pressures like DJ Wanham and, of course, Zadarius Smith. But he's been quiet, and this is a first since, maybe when he was creeping on a come-up in 2017. We're not used to Hunter just not getting pressures and not getting sacks. And I expected it to perhaps change against the Saints, but it was a surprise that he, for a 4th straight game, was relatively quiet. Now, his PFF grade is still marvelous, 77-something. But he is not the tyrant that you know and love, dating back to probably 2019 as his best season. And, of course, injuries plagued him the last 2 years. But it's interesting to follow whether or not he busts out and becomes the Danielle Hunter who has the massive contract. Because that's why this is a concern or an issue, is because Hunter is paid to be like one of the Bosas. And right now, he's just kind of a dude that's getting attention from other offensive lines. So Cousins flipping the script on how he usually does things, Hunter being quiet. Number 3 is Dalvin Tomlinson. I believe he told Chris Thomason before the season started that he wants to be a Pro Bowler. Well, he's well on his way. If you look up and down the Vikings defensive roster, Tomlinson's really the only guy that hasn't had a quiet or bad game. Now, dudes like Zadarius Hunter obviously haven't had stinkers, but through and through on the Vikings defense, almost every starter has had one game that's kind of blah or meh. Dalvin Tomlinson has not. He has an 80.5 PFF grade, which leads the team, everybody. He surpassed the almighty Josh Metellus. And Tomlinson is the anchor of the Vikings' trenches right now, especially against the run defense that isn't very good in general. Just think of where the Vikings would be without Dalvin Tomlinson. But he's quietly been consistent. That's kind of his nature in general. Just a jolly, silent dude. And he was wonderful against the Saints, and he's been wonderful through 4 games. So thank God for Dalvin Tomlinson. I know he's an expensive quasi-nose tackle / defensive tackle. but he's worth it so far. And he didn't disappoint against the Saints. And for a guy like that who isn't a household name, you kind of expect him to have an average game at some point, and he really has not. The next one is Darisaw in back-to-back weeks having career games. Now, his career isn't that old in the tooth, but he led the Vikings in offensive grade against the Lions, and he led the Vikings in offensive grade against the Saints. So everything that was forecasted about him in the summer, this dude's going to be Trent Williams, it's to a degree, it's happening. Darisaw is becoming a staple of the offensive line. We don't have Matt Khalil-itis, where he just nosedived after the good rookie year. He's getting better. He's doing the opposite of Khalil. And he's put together back-to-back games that are becoming of a Pro Bowl tackle. And it's you couldn't ask for more, especially when you look over at the other guy in the Chargers who the Vikings could have drafted, Rashawn Slater. Now he's been lost for the season. And you start to count your blessings that Darisaw was, Spielman's final first-round pick. But in back-to-back weeks, Darisaw has delivered with no signs of, this is... You aren't feeling like these are outliers one bit. He looks the part, especially on tape against the Saints. Next one is a little bit more of a negative, and I touched on this yesterday, is the mere fact that the Vikings couldn't spank an undermanned team. Now, the Saints don't suck. Their defense is good and will probably remain good for the rest of the season. But let's face it, they didn't have their QB1, RB1, WR1, or their left guard. And if we were doing a show here previewing the Bears game and the Vikings didn't have Kirk Cousins, Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, or Ezra Cleveland, you'd be panicking. So that's towards the middle of the weekend. That's what Saints fans were doing, and the Vikings eked out a win thanks to a long missed field goal. Vikings got out of there alive and didn't have to go to overtime, where I'm sure some tomfoolery would have happened. They should have beat the Saints by at least a touchdown and probably more. It was a neutral field. It wasn't a true road game, but they didn't. They hung in there. I know a win's a win, and I'm not dogging them for it, but the surprise coming out of that game, based on what we learned over the last weekend, no Winston, no Michael Thomas, no Alvin Kamara, they should have won in a romp. Alas, they did not. Next, the third down woes on offense have not stopped. They started well in the first quarter. I think they started 4 for 4 on third down, and they finished 5 for 14. So as of now, through 4 games, the Vikings rank 28th in offensive third down conversion percentage. That must be cleaned up. Otherwise, if they do get to the postseason, they will be bounced right away. Teams that struggle on third down don't make much noise down the stretch. So the hope is that as Cousins acclimates to a new offensive coordinator, like I said a little while ago, and Kevin O'Connell gets to know his team more, that these third down numbers will go up. Because I'm here to report, if you can't convert on third down in an offense-driven league, you're not very good, and you're fool's gold if you happen to sneak into the postseason. I think this next one is also a repeat, but forgive me because it's dreadfully important, is field goals instead of touchdowns ain't gonna do it either. Kind of like third down conversion percentage. They got away with it against the Saints because the Saints were down to nubbins on offense, but there's no way on God's green earth that the Vikings will beat a Tua-led Dolphins team if he plays, or looking down the road in Buffalo if you have to settle for 4 field goals when you could have scored touchdowns. It will not work against good teams, and it usually won't work against just average teams. The Vikings got away with one, so when they get down in the red zone offense for some reason has been a problem this year. It never was with Mike Zimmer at the helm. It must be growing pains. Kicking field goals, leaving 4 points on the board, will get your ass kicked against a team that knows what it's doing. The Saints were a team that didn't really know what it was doing because they didn't have their full strength roster. But I will pound this home over and over again, especially if it doesn't improve. This field goal bullshit instead of touchdowns, I mean, once in a while, once per game is fine. Or maybe even once every couple weeks is doable. But, just getting down on the other side of the field in an opponent's territory and third down, incomplete, going to have to kick a field goal, 3 points, baby. Not going to do it. Not going to work against the Bills in Buffalo. You can book that. And then finally, my other surprise is I expected a comeuppance on this penalty situation. Through 4 weeks, the Vikings are the least penalized team in the NFL. And it continued. They only had 5 flags for 35 yards, which is pretty decent, especially those low yards. And in franchise history, the Vikings' 95 penalty yards assessed against them is the lowest in 62 years for the Vikings. It's not an NFL record, but the Vikings have never started a season through 4 games with fewer penalty yards than this version. And that bodes well. It's a good omen for a first-year head coach because it shows the team is disciplined. And you'd have every excuse in the book to have a rookie head coach and him just, being right in the middle of the league or getting flagged all the time. But these Vikings are playing disciplined, and that's probably why they're 3-1, because as we go through this carousel or this roller coaster of offense is good, then it's not, defense is allowing chunk yardage, but then it rises up when it matters. You're going to have consistency, and right now that is special teams and low penalties, and that's why you're winning ball games. Thank you, Ryan Wright. Thank you, Greg Joseph, but not for the missed extra point. And then the low penalties across the board. It's offense and defense. It's not lopsided. They're not getting flagged, and it is glorious. So, the weird Cousins dynamic. The guy has morphed into a winner of games and less emphasis on stats. I think everybody can embrace that. Quiet Danielle Hunter. When does he roar back? He's bound to, because he's not playing poorly. He's just not getting the sacks or the pressures that he's accustomed to. Dalvin Tomlinson has been the most consistent performer on defense. He has not had a blah game, and he's heading towards that Pro Bowl that he forecasted right now with an 80.5 PFF grade. Christian Darrisaw, back-to-back weeks, leading the Vikings on offense per PFF grade. Bada bing. Vikings could not beat an undermanned team without a QB1, WR1, RB1, or left guard. That's concerning. Write that down. The third down woes on offense continued. Not gonna work. They got to get better. If they can't give it on third down, this season will be hogwash. Field goals instead of touchdowns ain't gonna beat a good team. I hope you remember that one. And then low penalties through 4 games is a pleasant surprise that I don't think any of us forecasted. Maybe it's because Oli Udoh isn't playing any snaps. That's all I got. We'll be back with Josh Fry on Wednesday, and we'll talk about the Saints win one more time and start previewing the Bears' skull, baby.